I'm Scott Hardy. I'm the founder of Top Class Actions. I founded Top Class Actions in 2008. We are now the world's most popular website for consumers to find lawsuits and settlements they can claim. We get 2 to 3 million viewers per month organically. You say, Scott, that has nothing to do with funding. Why are you bringing it up? Great question. I'll get there. So then I was also one of the very first Arizona ABSs. Arizona, of course, changed the rules in Arizona to allow non-lawyers to own a law firm. And shocker, I'm not a lawyer. I'm just a tech geek. But thankfully, I work with awesome people. We were able to start an Arizona ABS. And now we've signed tens of thousands of clients to our law firm thanks to the powers of Top Class Actions, which still has nothing to do with funding. But then last year, after doing a little bit of litigation funding through my law firm, I said, you know what? I could do this. And so I started a litigation funding arm. And so now we have Trimaxion, and Trimaxion allows accredited investors throughout the world to invest in single bits of litigation on the mass tort side of things. Our first fund was for NEC cases. Those are toxic baby formula causing necrotizing enterocolitis. Our second fund targeted video game addiction. And our third fund, which is active and accepting accredited investors right now, is targeting social media harm. For our fund, we raise the money, we loan it to my law firm, who then spends it at Top Class Actions, so we can watch every penny along the way. Now, Susan, you do it on a much larger scale than me. Well, I'm just doing single-digit millions right now. You want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I am a lawyer, but it's been a very, very long time since I practiced, so I feel sort of a bit feral nowadays. I don't think I'd be employable as a lawyer. And through a sliding doors moment back in 2002, found myself with just £1 million, setting up my first funder to fund typically insolvency claims, and then set up Harbour in 2007, and we have been funding all types of claims all over the world since then, with a growing element of class actions in numerous jurisdictions, but particularly Australia, in the UK, and in the US, and those vary from mass torts to funding 200,000 women in their equal pay claims through to shareholder class actions. So a big range of things, and that's all that we do.
It's so awesome to be here on the panel with you and your level of experience. And not surprisingly, if you know Susan, your name came up in conversations earlier as the expert's expert on funding. And so,
I'm waiting for the day when it comes up because somebody says I'm going to run away and join the circus, but that doesn't happen yet, so there we go.
Well, and so thank you, Susan, for being on the panel. And of course, we have Miguel. And Miguel, I've been friends with Miguel for years now. I think it was my very first GLG conference I came to and went to lunch, and I met Miguel, and he was just filing these class actions. He was, I think, the very first class action lawyer for Milberg in Portugal. And now, Miguel is the leading class action litigator in Portugal. Is it safe to say that? Filing many cases, a lot of success. Your law firm has grown dramatically. And so, from your perspective, Miguel,
thank you. Thank you. Before I get too embarrassed, no, I would say we haven't had any success yet because we haven't had claims reach the end and consumers being compensated. So that would be my first note on that. So I'm a professor. I approach this from the academic side first, and then I started approaching it as a practitioner. And indeed, as you say, we're running about 60 class actions in Portugal, always from the claimant side, and many of those are funded, but not all. So some of them are pro bono, some are funded, and we get to see the difficulties and advantages of working with and without funding in these cases.
Okay, and so I can't wait until we celebrate your first settlements and distributions to your clients. That it will come, my friend. And as the owner of a law firm, and as many of you can understand these things, holy moly, it takes forever and it's so expensive. And I thought I'd be a very wealthy man at this point, but right now I'm still very poor as I'm self-funding everything for the most part along the way.
It is
It's
very
a
long.
I don't feel anybody pitying me in the audience, so,
Yeah.
so get over that. Let's get right into it then, going to litigation funding myths. And I'll start and just say one of the big litigation funding myths is that it's only private equity groups who are putting in all this money, and that is absolutely not true. There are a lot of wealthy investors that are looking for alternative ways to invest, and naturally Trimaxion goes through that. What are a couple of litigation funding myths that you
Yeah, and look, it's interesting hearing Seema speaking before, and as was helpfully identified, there's an enormous amount on our Venn diagram of how we feel, there's an enormous amount of crossover, and I think it's important to recognize that. But just a couple of things which I guess slightly aggravate me is that funders fund speculative claims. I have no idea why anybody thinks we would do that and stay in business, because
People only say that if they have not tried to get
I know,
litigation
right?
funding.
You've got to be crazy. It's bad enough when it's a good case. It still takes forever. So speculative claims, that's nonsense, and particularly in jurisdictions like this one where you've got adverse costs. Why would you do that? Because when it's exposed as being a bad case, you've got to pay the other side's costs. And the other point, and this is going to possibly make me unpopular with quite a large part of the room, is I do get frustrated that everybody's saying, oh, the big bad funder. The lawyer represents the client. It is the lawyer's responsibility to make sure the funding is all in place, to make sure, crucially, that the after-the-event insurance is in place and legitimate, because, quite rightly highlighting the SSB situation, the fact that the funder failed, that the law firm failed, the clients lost nothing. Where they did get exposed is because there was not the after-the-event insurance in place. And for me, that's a critical thing, that we protect the clients and we do not leave them with any exposure in these circumstances. So can we please keep in mind that it's the lawyers who are at the heart of this and who are running the cases, not us.
Well, and that's so true, whether it's in the UK, whether it's in the US. We hear the same thing as some of the funders are they're driving litigation. They're not driving litigation. And for any cases that my law firm has been funded, we're driving it. We're working with the litigators. We're making the decisions. We're taking care of the client's needs to make sure that they happen. The funder, of course, wants to get a return on their capital, a return on their investment, but they're not driving the case at all. Miguel, what's your take?
Yeah, I would mention too. I would continue your point to say that indeed there seems to be this cultural resistance from the defense side, but also from some judges, to the idea that it is possible at all to have a hands-off funder. We see some impulses to say, well, you know, whoever provides the money is controlling the case, and there seems to be this misperception that when a funder comes into a consumer case, especially an opt-out case, it knows that its ability to get back its investment is dependent on it being hands-off. And so the funder is more interested than anyone else in making sure that it does its due diligence at the beginning, it rolls the dice, and then it knows it can't interfere. We've seen that it can go wrong, like in Merrick's v. MasterCard, but that's the risk. So that's one of the problems that we see. One of the, what was the word you used?
Myth.
Myth. The other myth I would mention, we actually just heard it now. The myth that if we have funded opt-out actions, businesses will flee the UK or they will flee Portugal. I would be really, really interested in hearing one example of a business who would say, if we are held accountable to our infringements, we will no longer do business in the UK. Because that is essentially what's being argued. Nobody's arguing, if you force us to go to court in unmeritorious claims and spend money unnecessarily, we will leave the UK, because that's not the reality.
Wait, but that's exactly what happened in the United States. There are no more companies in existence.
Yeah.
We're the largest class actions. Oh, wait, no, that's right.
That's right.
It's a bit of a meritless claim there. Very good point. What are some of the benefits of litigation funding?
Well, I think most people, it's always amazing to me how people think that it's somehow more complicated than it is. You know, what I say is, you know, I've been giving presentations for 23 years now, and I kind of like, wow, I'm amazed anybody's interested. What do I do for a living? I pay bills. That's not very exciting. But fundamentally, if you look in the CAT, none of those cases would have proceeded without funding. So where you have individually small cases, but collectively are larger, they cannot proceed on their own. And so if there were no funding, that would allow these infringers, and keep in mind in the CAT, in many cases, those defendants have already been found by a regulator to be criminally liable for what they have done. So this is just the follow-on that goes from that. So it is enabling, in the same way as I talk about our 200,000 women and their equal pay claims, individually they could not bring their claims. So it's particularly valuable there. But then you look at the claimants also in the CAT, who are huge corporates, and they nonetheless have finite legal budgets. So they need the money in order to bring the claims. And just one final point about PACCAR, quickly. PACCAR has had a massive impact. Just look at the number of claims that have been issued in the CAT compared with pre-PACCAR. It's fallen off a cliff. So it does have an impact. It remains important to get it done. But the benefits, I think, are evident to those who want choices as they decide whether they finance their real estate or their trains or their aeroplanes. It is just another form of finance for a business activity.
Well, and what I encourage defendants who are unhappy with me when I report on their cases on top class actions, and they say, oh my gosh, you're making false claims, when of course we're just reporting on cases, is I say what you can do as a defendant that will help you immensely is take care of your clients or customers. If you did something wrong, and we know you're guilty of it, there's the proof out there, take care of the settlement. Reach out to all of the potential claimants out there and let them know that you care, that the customer is important to them. And that, you know, I know that our US judges want to make sure this isn't a marketing spend for the defendants, that justice is being served, but people remember, and if there's an honest mistake that happens, the defendant should be taking care of their client. Mm-hmm. What's your opinion there, Miguel?
Yeah, I agree. I think the main benefit, and we all know this, and we've heard it ad nauseum, is access to justice. That being said, it's access to justice in a very specific set of cases that is a narrow fringe of the cases that are out there that need to be litigated in order to protect consumers. And I think that's something that's often overlooked. Commercial funding is great. We absolutely need it. It will also mean that society doesn't have to spend public resources on funding certain type of cases, but it doesn't give us access to justice in a lot of other cases that are just not commercially viable. So it doesn't do away with the need for public funding and other such solutions. I also think that one of the things that we're seeing now in terms of the reaction to the benefits of funding is that funding is, I don't know if you're going to get to this, Tom. Are you going to talk about regulation later, or?
I've got a long list here.
All right. So I'll leave that for then. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, and so I think that brings in a point that we talked about on our call, was that you need to work with experts in the space, including both the lawyers and the funders. And so it's important for law firms out there that are looking for funding that they are talking to other lawyers and law firms who have received funding, and that they're working with funders that can deliver. And so how is it, from your perspective, Sousa, what would it be on working with the right experts to make sure that you're making the right decisions on funding a case?
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons for wanting to work with an experienced funder is litigation is hard, and it has all sorts of rocks in the road. And what you don't want is to be dealing with a funder who is staffed by people who don't really understand, so that if there's a bad interlocutory decision, they go, oh my God, we've got to stop funding, this is a disaster, because that's just normal, right? That's our lives of weird stuff that happens, and being able to properly evaluate it is a really important. So you've got a calm and steady funder. I remain staggered, and this is to one of Seema's points, quite legitimately. I can't remember the last time anybody asked us to prove that we have money. And that should be the lawyer's number one question is, A, show me you have the money, and B, show me you've ring-fenced it for my case, so that we're not gambling on the outcomes of other cases in order to pay my bills. So simple questions, and these are not being asked as much as they should be by the lawyers, who are the principal beneficiaries of funding, by the way. And so there needs to be more of that goes on. And yeah, talk to other lawyers. We like it when clients, funded clients, get third-party advice about the agreements, because we think then everybody goes into this eyes wide open, knowing exactly what's going to happen.
Right, and I've seen deals. I personally had a deal where I had a handshake deal for $25 million. And a month later, after I'd hired a lawyer and a bunch of paralegals, they went, we're not going to do it.
Yeah.
What? Well, this is not good.
Yeah.
And I've had friends that had significant funding deals similar size that they got dispersals up to about 7.5, 10 million, and then poof, it's cut off. And they're like, well, we need this to continue.
Yeah.
And they're left in the lurch.
Yeah.
So it's so critical.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Consumer Association I advise has actually used the criterion of whether the funder has experience in funding class actions in some jurisdiction, especially European jurisdictions, as a criterion of preference when choosing funders. And the reason for that is precisely because it is a different mentality when you're funding consumer protection or when you're funding B2B cases. You really need to understand the importance of being hands-off, and so that is an aspect that would always be, I think, valued if you're coming in already with that kind of experience and guarantee that this is how you behave. I'm curious, funnily enough, I'm not so worried about money running out, personally. Because I find that, if we're running a case and we got this case funded, it's a good case, it's a meritorious case, it has a chance of succeeding. And if the funder wants to be negligent to the point of not guaranteeing that it has the money to fund up till the end, what's going to happen is that at some point I'm going to have to go back to the market and say, hey, my client has this case to be funded. Years have gone by, we're way ahead, we're much closer to the end, this will be much cheaper for you. Would you like to fund it? And at that point, it will be an even more interesting perspective of funding. So maybe this is me being naive.
No, I hear what you're saying. It's just that we all know that it can take time to get the funding in place. And for you, that puts you in a risk position as the people running it, that you have got this lack of coverage for your costs. And so I just think life is easier if you start knowing that your budget of £10 million is ring-fenced and clear with your name on it. Now, do budgets overrun? Yes, all the time. And these things happen. But at least if you start from there, it feels like you've got one less thing, hopefully, to think about.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And, one of the cases that we actively funded, one of our mass torts, we've now hit the end of the capital, and the defendant hasn't settled yet. And so now our funder's just like, hey, you want to double up?
Yep.
And if it's like you said, if it's a good case, there's absolutely more capital there. Something that we're seeing a lot of are law firms that are refinancing debt as interest payments have ballooned due to increased case duration.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of this, probably more in the US, where lawyers were taking on loans, interest-bearing loans, which may have to pay the interest along the way, or it may be picked and rolled up to the end. And another thing that lawyers can tend to be overly optimistic about is how long something's going to take. So they take something on at an interest rate of X, and if that interest rate X had been for 3, 4, even 5 years, they would have been okay. But they're then seeing this interest rise and rise and rise, and suddenly they're looking at it going, actually, I'm not going to make any money out of this. And then they come to us and say, well, will you refinance this? And it's like, but you have no headroom anymore because the claim value hasn't increased. So how are we all going to get paid in this scenario? And unfortunately, lawyers are not great at just doing that little bit of math at the beginning to say, let me look at the worst case scenario, because they know these things take years and years and years, and just kind of going, oh, I've got some money and I can get on. And that's really common, really common.
Yeah, and it's interesting when I saw some cases that got funded and then the case fell apart.
Yeah.
And that's a very, very challenging situation.
Yeah,
right now, the only cases I'm funding, for the most part, we're getting significant funding for, meaning 8 figures plus, are mature cases that have moved along and secure.
Yeah.
Scott, it's so interesting how different jurisdictions handle this drastically differently. Like I understand the reality that you're describing, that Susan's talking about, but for example, in Portugal, every single class action that is pursued by the consumer association that I represent, every single law firm, every single economist, experts that work for that association commit to a maximum budget.
Oh,
and
I would love that.
there is a contract saying, we don't care. If this goes over the budget, if you want to work for us, this is the commitment, because the Consumer Association doesn't have funds of its own. It only can do the case because it goes out to a funder and gets the money to pay these service providers. So it needs this commitment that this is the limit. And so there is a risk sharing with the service providers that, but there's also a commitment of, this is a public service as well. Yes, you're going to make some money. You're not going to be doing this just because you're a kind person, but you're also taking on a public service. And so if your own estimate, because each service provider estimated its own budget, if your own estimate turns out to be wrong, that's on you.
Well, and it's my understanding that the UK courts understand the problem with case duration for plaintiff lawyers, while EU courts have not been as flexible yet. What's been your experience on that? With EU courts not really being as flexible with the case duration, while the UK courts tend to understand it.
Yeah, there was a very interesting obiter dictum by a court in the Lisbon Appeal Court, if I'm not mistaken, where there was an argument saying, if this case is suspended, so it's an interesting comparison. In the Apple app case, whereas in the UK they've already had the ruling in the first instance, in Portugal the Apple app case was suspended basically for 7 years, we don't know how long, but until there is a final ruling in the public enforcement at the European level. So appeal at the EGC, then appeal at the ECJ. And we appealed that suspension, and one of the arguments we used was, look, yes, in this case we have funding, but if this is the message we're giving out to the market, that if you file a case like this, it can get suspended for years and years, and there's nothing we can do about it, you won't even discuss whether this jeopardizes effectiveness. The consequence of that is that the funding market will dry up. And the Lisbon Appeal Court replied, we don't think that is a consideration that we can even have here. The funder is not a party, is not an injured party, it has no position in these proceedings. So basically, we don't care if this dries up the funding market. That was the position. So I would agree with you. Whereas in the CAT, you often hear the judges saying, if we don't have funding, this doesn't work, so we need to take into account the concerns of funding. In the Portuguese courts, we have statements like that. Yes, funding is fundamental, we need it, especially at the competition court, but no decision yet that has been, well, if cases keep taking this long, we won't have funding anymore.
Yeah, and that's so painful. I mean, we've got a case in the US where a judge has now said, hey, we're going to do these next 2 trials. We've got a defense pick for a bellwether trial, then we have a plaintiff pick for a bellwether trial, and then guess what? We're bundling up to 10 cases a month, so we can do 120 a year. So now the defendant's like, all right, after about 7 years of litigation, okay, I think we may be on track for a settlement, so we'll see. But we get that push. I mean, that's got to be painful, because I'm sure the funder is always happy to pause any interest when there's some kind of 7-year pause, right?
Our oldest case started in 2008. and it's still ongoing.
That is
Yeah, it's long.
expensive.
Yeah, it's long. It's boring after a while as well.
Well, and so talking about Portugal, Miguel, is there a system in place that pays the funder from undistributed funds?
Yes. So Portugal is probably the member state where this has been regulated in a very special way. The Portuguese law says that the funder will be paid only from the undistributed portion of the global compensation, which can exist or might not exist. We talk a lot about the low distribution rates, but a lot of the cases that are pending in Portuguese courts are cases that will probably lead to direct payment in invoices, which means that most of the class will be reimbursed directly by the defendant, and there will be very little money left for the funder. The money left will be from consumers who have changed to another service provider in the meantime, or who have died and their inheritors are not going to claim. So there might still be some money left for undistributed, but not much. That is a concern also in terms of some cases not being good for funding. In fact, it's a problem because the cases which will have the highest distribution rates are the ones where private funders won't be interested in them. And one judge at the competition court is even proposing, she hasn't made the decision yet, but she's proposing to send a question to the European Court of Justice to ask if such a system creates a conflict of interests between the funder and the consumer and the claimant, where the funder is only interested in funding cases where there will be a low distribution rate. However, this is another, going back to the beginning, this is one of those examples, in my view, of how the cultural barrier to not being able to think as a hands-off funder comes in. Because it does not matter what the funder thinks about the distribution or what it would like the distribution to be. If the claim is fully controlled as it must be, by the claimant and its lawyers, they will do the best possible thing to get a high distribution rate, regardless of what the funder would like. And that's what happens in practice. And so the very concern is strange. Even though I would be the first one to say, I would love it if our money came off the top instead of from the undistributed global compensation, because then we would have more cases funded.
Yeah, because it highlights why you should just, at the beginning, have the contractual position. That's the contractual position. And then, of course, if there's a massive shortfall, as we've seen in Merrick's, from what the lawyer said was a £16 billion claim and was a £200 million claim, obviously there is compromise that needs to happen. But fundamentally, you've got to start with the contractual position, right? Otherwise, you can end up with these weird little conflicts.
Can I?
Yeah.
I'm actually not going to agree with you on that one.
Okay.
Because I really think that this is, you can say anything you want in the contract. Ultimately, I'm talking about consumer class actions, of course.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it is up to the court to look at the case. How long did it last? How risky was it? How complex? How much did it cost? What was the price on the market for offering funding of this type of cases at the time? And decide whether or not the remuneration is adequate. At the end, at the very end, you need to look back and decide all this. I don't think it can be decided at the beginning, and I certainly don't think that whatever was in the contract will ever be binding on the court or should be considered as a guidance by the court. We put in the contract something which we think reflects market price. But if the court decides that it does not, and there will be evidence produced on this at the time, then it's really up to the court to say, I am here to protect consumers, I am here to protect the distribution of the claim, and so the remuneration, I think, should be this one. That being said, given that in Portugal the remuneration comes from the undistributed portion, that concern is slightly reduced. But still, I think it's there and it has to be taken into account by the court.
Well, and when we're looking at how these funding contracts are written, there are third-party intermediaries that help put lawyers and funders together. Do you believe that it could be useful for a law firm to come directly to the funder, or is it more useful to use a third-party intermediary to kind of put the deal together? And I know they charge 1% to 3%, so it can get hefty depending on the size.
Yeah, I mean, look, For a long time, I sort of thought, I don't know why there's a need for that. I do understand it more in relation to provision of insurance, because I think that's a bit more difficult to understand. With the addition of newer entrants in the private credit market and that sort of thing, you know, perhaps there is more need for this. I think the question is, who's paying for that? Because it's the claimant group who are saying, we need to go and find this, and then they want us to pay for it. And I'm like, well, you know, you could also have come to us directly. You didn't have to do that. I understand that there's you know, things to be done there, but it's balancing up that position and what the amount is that could be charged in those circumstances, because beyond time, there's not risk that's being taken at the same level as risk as we take. And what it does, it just adds to the cost of the funding. But I think I'm more sympathetic to the use of an intermediary with the quite high number of additional new entrants that I'm seeing who, you know, I used to go to conferences and know everybody, and now I don't know everybody. And, you know, the users must feel the same.
Absolutely, Miguel.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, so from the claimant's perspective, intermediaries have become a really useful, important tool. It's just, as Susan said, the market is so much bigger now. There's so many actors. And I know this has been discussed in the UK as well, or I believe it has. The claimant, the representative of the class has an obligation to get the best possible terms for the represented class. And so, is the Consumer Association in a position to go out to the market and talk to all of the funders that are out there and see who has the best prices? No. And the Consumer Association is not a professional who has specialized in this. So it is really great to be able to turn to a service provider who is a professional, who does this for a living, and say, can you get us the best possible terms?
And I have one big caveat to that, which is that intermediaries are not always completely honest about who they go and talk to, because they might get paid different commission rates by different funders. And I know there's been a number of occasions where I've had people I know at law firms saying, oh, well, you're not interested in my case. I went, it never got presented to me. And that's because the intermediary was getting a higher commission rate from another funder, and so they directed it in that direction. So be really sure to ask what the commission rate is that these intermediaries are getting.
That's such a good point. And one of the things that we require when we work with intermediaries is a final report on who was contacted, what replies did you get?
Yeah, that's a really good
because then we can prevent precisely this kind of situation.
Yeah.
And I was just going to add, it's great to work with intermediary, but we are very much aware of the problem that was already identified, which is that it hikes up the costs and that reduces the number of cases that are commercially viable.
Yeah.
So it's great, especially for big cases. If it's a small case, we would probably bite the bullet and say, well, we have to do an effort to do this ourselves, otherwise it gets even more expensive.
Yeah.
Well, I think you want to look at experience level for your intermediaries. They need to have a lot of experience being able to fund the types of cases that you're trying to get that funding for, and talk to a number of people. When I talk to different funders, they say, sure, Scott, happy to go ahead and get you 5 million, 10 million, 20 million. And then some of them will say, oh, it's going to be 25% interest. And I go, well, how much of that is your take? Because that is exorbitant. Mm-hmm. And especially if you haven't gone out and got funding for a case yet, you want to have that level of experience going through.
But let me add something that I think is a new development we've seen in the intermediary market. We were having a lot of problems sometimes preparing cases to the level that funders, rightfully so, require the case to be prepared before they do their due diligence and decide whether or not this is a good investment, especially when it comes to obtaining kind of preliminary economic reports on damages, which can be very costly, as we all know, and the Consumer Association simply doesn't have money to pay for those. So if a funder says, well, you know, we need to see some kind of of economic study on this, and very often they're not willing to put in the money to do so, or, which is more accurate, if you're going to many funders, they're not all going to pay for that, right? So you need to have some kind of system in place to first pay for those expenses, hoping to get them back. If you don't have money for it, how can you do that? And we've seen intermediaries now emerge in the market who provide seed funding. And that has been really useful for some types of cases. You get the seed funding or round A funding to make sure that you have the case duly prepared and that you can convince funders that this is a meritorious case, it's worth your investment. And then, of course, this seed funding is going to have to be remunerated, and we go back to the same problem. Yes, it gets more costly, but sometimes that really is the inevitable cost of putting together a good case that can get funded.
Absolutely. Any final points before we open it up for any questions?
I'd like to make just one point on regulation, which I wanted to mention earlier. We really, really do need regulation. And I think both sides agree on this. And right now, the devil is in the details. And we're seeing more sophisticated approaches from the business lobbying side to make sure that the depth of the funding of consumer opt-out comes from, the fine print in the regulation. Because nobody can say we don't need funding. What you can say is, yeah, allow funding, but do it in a certain way that will kill it. I think that's the next debate, but we definitely need regulation because we all need clarity, we need certainty, and if we have good rules in place, and that's the discussion. Yep. But if we have good rules in place that let the market function, cases will be faster, there will be more funded actions, funding will be cheaper.
Yeah, I just two comments on that. A, the person at the center of all of this is obviously the client, but is the lawyers who are themselves regulated and owe duties of care to their clients, and they must not forget that. And B, this word regulation gets used as if it's kind of a cure-all for something. First, identify what the harms are that you think are being caused by the funder, because I think you'll find quite a lot of them should actually be solved by the lawyers running the case. I have no problem at all with regulation because I know the way that good funders behave, but can we just be really clear about what harms we are trying to address rather than this general regulation wafting?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's frame it together. All right, thank you very much. Are there any questions out there?
Hi, we've had a question come in via the app. So someone's asked whether the panel could comment on the Merrick-Insworth situation and suggest how that could be avoided.
Can't hear you very well. Something about Merricks and Insworth?
Someone was wondering what your views are on the Merrick-Insworth dispute and how it can be avoided.
Okay. I've got to get my edit button. Get your edit button on, Susan. Don't air your dirty laundry in public, number one. There was clearly a breakdown of love and communication in that relationship. But, somebody set some expectations about what that claim was going to be worth, which proved to be very, very, very wrong. And in those circumstances, you are going to have people who are a bit fed up. But don't air your laundry in public. It doesn't help anybody.
Do you have any comment on Miguel?
I would just say I love how that specific story proved how independent the claimant was.
That's very true. Yeah,
that's true.
Very true.
Last question, and also the public service aspect that you mentioned, which is at least part of what you do. And we all know a little bit about class actions, but the public only know what they read in the papers. And going back to Merrick's and also picking up a little bit of what Seema was saying, if you look at Merrick's, it went on for the best part of 10 years. The earn-out for notwithstanding the stats about who's earning what, the law firms and the funders are earning telephone numbers with the international dialing codes attached. and those who did bother to get a payout will get a price of a couple of cinema tickets and maybe a pint afterwards. So putting yourself in the position of a member of the public looking at this and picking up on what Seema was saying, yeah, justice has been served, MasterCard's been held liable to a greater or less degree, but surely ordinary members of the public will think to themselves, there must be a better, more efficient way than this for me to get 50 quid in my pocket. Wonder if you have any comment?
I agree, and one of the things that, again, Seema and I agree about a lot of things, but I take a bit of exception about is this idea that in this idyllic fairy world that redress schemes will sort it all out. The post office, which got criticised because it said, look what the funders got paid, but yes, look what the sub-postmasters are ultimately getting paid, which they would not have been paid but for the funded litigation. So, yes, I'd love to live in a world where we don't need lawyers to run these cases, that a redress scheme just sprouts up whenever there's a problem. We all know that that's not true. And just one other point, which is where Miguel and I might have a slight disagreement, is about leaving judges to make decisions about what the funder should get. If you watched any of that Merrick's hearing, the one where they were challenging, it was astonishing, the lack of knowledge that was demonstrated by everybody in that room. Some deliberately, because it kind of helped them, but suggesting things like, oh, you should get a guilt type return on a 10-year case with a binary outcome that reduced like it did. In what world would any idiot ever take that up? So I would love to think that the minute something bad happens, a redress scheme springs up, people know exactly how to do it, and they don't need any of us to help them with it. That is not the world we live in. So, we need to get real about that.
Well, and I think it's important when you've got these class action settlements that are happening, that you do set the expectation appropriately for the end consumer. I get it all the time with all the viewers we get at Top Class Actions, and they go, hey, I hear people are getting paid thousands of dollars. I say, you were shorted $5. So now you're getting $5. You're not getting $100 in punitive damages here. And so I think setting that expectation correctly on these cases really helps cement the road so the consumer knows what they're going to get.
Yeah, but I think the issue raised goes deeper than that. And thank you for that question, which is great. Unfortunately, we have 1 minute to the end, and that would be an entire other debate. But I think two things that I'll try to say very quickly. One, I agree with Susan that now there is this, and we heard it already today, now there is a new bet by the business lobby to say, and studies sponsored by the business lobby defending this, saying the way to go is public enforcement. Let's give ombudsmen the right to do this. That is great. I'm all for that. It will never be a solution in itself. If you look at the whole history of Europe, even in the Scandinavian countries, where you have traditionally a high degree of voluntary compliance, ombudsmen never file these cases. They just don't. In the Scandinavian countries, there's been like 1 in 25 years in one of them. The other one has never filed. Let's not kid ourselves. We're proposing a solution because we know it doesn't work. That's the thing. I would love for ombudsmen to do more of these cases, but they have to be a complement, not the alternative, not the solution that excludes private enforcement. And finally, on the public perception, that is key. And this is going to be something that we really need to fight. The way to shift that, in my view, is to say opt-out is not about getting money into everybody who was injured. Opt-out is about understanding that you will never get money to everybody who was injured because there is rational apathy. That's the starting point. Opt-out is about justice in the sense of who gets to keep the money. Do you, the infringer, because you're smart, and you infringe, you do mass damages in a way that is super hard to distribute, do you get to keep the money? Or does that money get taken away from you, distributed to as many people as possible, and then whoever doesn't come get their money because they don't want to, or the information didn't get to them, unfortunately, then that money that is left over goes to the good of society, it goes to charities. That's the real struggle, changing the public narrative, changing public perception. This is not about getting money to everybody. This is about who gets to keep unlawful profits. Is it the companies or is it society? And I think the choice is easy.
It's a great point. It's about justice. Well, I'd like to thank my panel. Thank you, Miguel. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, GLG.
Thank you.